No cowhand could break the widowed judge's Palomino. The deaf bride rode him at sunrise. The horse came to me already ruined. That's what the men said. Harlan Tate said it, and Harlan had been working horses since before I passed the bar, so I didn't argue with him. He said, "That Palomino's been broke wrong somewhere down the line, Judge, and there ain't enough patience left in this county to fix him." I said, "What about yours?" He said, "I got none to spare." His name was Cotto, the Palomino's. I'd bought him off a horse trader out of Santa Fe 3 weeks before Clara died, which meant I'd had him 4 years now, and he'd thrown every man who tried to ride him inside those 4 years, including 2 of Harlan Tate's best hands and 1 man who came up from Albuquerque, specifically because someone told him he could do it. That man went home with a collarbone in pieces. The horse stood in my paddock and ate my hay and looked at men like they bored him, and I'd gotten used to it. I'd gotten used to a lot of things that were supposed to be temporary. Clara would have figured it out. That's not sentiment. She was just better with animals than I was, better with most living things, and she had a patience that I used to think was native to her, like eye color. But after she was gone, I understood it was something she'd worked at, quietly, every day, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own noise to see it while she was alive. I was a circuit judge for the territory. I spent 4 days of every week in a saddle between towns, and the 3 days I was home I was writing opinions, or receiving people with grievances, or managing the 100 things that go wrong on a working property when the owner is absent half his life. Clara managed the other 900. She kept the accounts and the garden and the 2 ranch hands and the social obligations I forgot and the mood of the house when I came home short-tempered from the road. She did all of it without complaint, which I mistook, for a long time, as evidence that it was easy. When she died of fever in October of 1884, I was 2 counties away at a trial that couldn't be postponed. I got the telegram in the morning and buried her by the time I arrived home. My foreman, a quiet Tejano named Esparza, had seen to everything. There was nothing left for me to do except stand at the grave in my good coat and feel the particular cold of a man who has missed the last important thing. I kept working, that's what I did. I rode the circuit and I heard cases and I wrote opinions. And I came home to a house that felt like a building rather than a place, and I fed the Palomino hay over the fence every morning, because the routine was something to hold onto even if the horse would rather I didn't bother him. The offer of a bride came through my old friend Luther Briggs, who was also a judge but a happier man, and who felt, I think, a personal responsibility to see me less hollow than I'd become. He wrote me a letter in the spring of 1886 saying he knew a woman in Denver, a widow herself, about 40 years old, schooled, capable, a good reader, whose one difficulty was that she had been deaf since childhood. He said he was writing to ask if the deafness gave me pause, and if it did, he said, then I probably hadn't thought it through, because the woman was extraordinary and the deafness was simply a condition. She'd learned to navigate better than most hearing people navigate their full faculties. I wrote back, send her particulars. Her name was Maren Schultz. She'd been born in Ohio, married young to a man named Schultz who'd built a dry goods business in Denver and died of heart trouble when she was 33, leaving her with enough to live on but not enough to feel secure. She was 41 now. She communicated by writing in a small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket, and by reading lips well enough that most conversations were manageable if the speaker faced her in decent light. I wrote to her. She wrote back. Her letters were careful and a little formal, and had a dry humor in them that I recognized as the kind you develop when you've had to work harder than other people for the same basic dignities. She didn't apologize for her deafness, and she didn't draw attention to it either. She treated it the way you treat a quality of your own that is neither flaw nor distinction, just a fact of the body that shapes certain logistics. We wrote for 2 months. I told her about the circuit and the case load. She told me about Denver and her late husband's business and the boarding house where she lived, run by a woman she described as well-meaning but intrusive. I told her about the property, the house, the two hands, Esparza, the acreage. I told her about Cato, and why I was telling her I don't entirely know, except that the horse was the one unresolved thing on the property, and it seemed dishonest not to mention it. She wrote back, "What kind of horse is he?" "Palomino," I wrote. "Big. 4-year standoff between us and he's winning." She wrote, "Does he respond to anything?" "Not to me," I wrote. She wrote, "I'll come in April and have a look at him." I read that twice. She wasn't promising anything. She was just saying she'd have a look. There was something in that, the plainness of it, the lack of drama, that I found I couldn't stop thinking about. She arrived on the 14th of April on the afternoon stage, and I was at the depot to meet her. I'd expected to feel the awkwardness of it, two strangers of a certain age, meeting in the dust of a stage depot with the intention of becoming family before the week was out. There was some awkwardness. But she stepped down from the stage in a dark blue traveling coat with a small trunk and a satchel, and she looked at me the way a practical person looks at a situation they've already decided to make work, and I found the awkwardness mostly dissolved in that. She was a tallish woman, angular in the face, with gray coming into her brown hair and eyes that were observant in a way I'd learned was partly compensation and partly just her nature. She held out her hand, and when I shook it, her grip was the grip of a woman who'd been doing things for herself a long time. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "The stage was late, I'm sorry." Then she looked up to read whatever I said. I said no matter, and she nodded, and we went to load her trunk. The marriage took place 2 days later at the county courthouse, which was my territory, with Esparza and my 2 ranch hands as witnesses. Marin wore her blue coat and I wore my judge's coat. The ceremony was performed by my clerk, who was Baptist, and said a few extra words that weren't part of the legal requirement, and Marin watched his mouth and caught most of it. Afterward, Esparza had put a meal together at the house. The man could cook, which I'd known for years, but Clara had known how to bring out in him in ways I never managed. It was quiet as far as wedding dinners go, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Marin had a way of filling silence that I noticed even then, not by talking, which she did less of than most people for obvious reasons, but by being entirely present in a room. She looked at things. She ate the food and she looked at the table and at Esparza and at the lamp in the corner, and I had the sense she was reading the room the way other people read a page. After the hands left, she took out her notebook and wrote, "Is there a horse I can see?" I brought her out to the paddock. The night was cool and there was a good moon, which mattered because she'd need the light. Cato was at the back of the paddock, standing the way he usually stood, a little sideways, a little removed, as if he'd already decided the situation didn't interest him. Marin leaned on the fence rail and looked at him for a while. She didn't try to call him or click her tongue or any of the standard gestures. She just leaned there. I watched her watch him, and I thought about the 4 years I'd spent failing to understand this horse, and felt the familiar low-grade irritation of that. And then I stopped thinking and just watched her. After a while she wrote in her notebook and held it toward me, "He's not broken wrong. He's listening for something." I read it twice. I said, "What's he listening for?" She wrote, "I don't know yet." She looked at the horse again. He was looking back. That was unusual. Most of the time he looked through you. She came out to the paddock the next morning before breakfast. I watched from the kitchen window. She was in the same blue coat and she moved along the fence slowly, not approaching him, not calling to him. She would stop and be still and then move again. The horse tracked her from the far side. After a while, maybe 20 minutes, he turned and faced her from the middle distance, not approaching, just orienting himself toward her. She didn't try to push it. She walked back to the house and came in and wrote, "I think it's noise." I said, "He doesn't hear things other horses don't." She wrote, "Not that kind." She thought for a moment, then wrote again, "People show up at him with intention. He can feel it." She underlined *intention*. He doesn't have a way to protect himself except refusal. I looked at that for a moment. I said, "So what's the remedy?" She wrote, "Show up without intention." She paused, then added, "I have practice at that." She came out to the paddock every morning for a week. I watched her some days, and some days I didn't, because I had work, and because I had a feeling that watching changed something in the situation. At the end of the week, she went into the paddock for the first time, not carrying anything, not in the direction of the horse. She went in and leaned against the fence post on the inside and read a book. She could read a book in the paddock because she didn't need to hear if the horse came up behind her. He stood at the back of the paddock and watched her. On the third morning, she went in with a book. He walked up behind her and blew once through his nose about 2 feet from her back, and she didn't turn. She kept reading. He stood there. After a while, he lowered his head and pulled a mouthful of grass near her boots. I was watching from the fence. Esparza came up beside me and we watched together. He said, "I'll be damned," quietly, not really meaning to say it out loud, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I couldn't have put a name to right then. Marin turned a page. The mornings settled into a rhythm. She went to Cato. I went to the circuit. She was running the house by the time I understood she was running the house, not in a dramatic way, but in the way a capable person occupies a space and makes it function. The accounts came into order, the garden got attention, the particular low-level chaos that had attended the property since Clara died flattened out. She and Esparza developed a working arrangement that seemed to involve a lot of written notes on a small chalkboard in the kitchen, and a mutual respect that I don't think either of them entirely expected. When I was home, I found myself noticing her in the way you notice something that has been in a room for a long time, and one day you realize it is the best thing in the room. The way she held a cup, the way she angled toward a window when she was reading, for the light, the way she never startled at loud sounds, which in a house with a man who let doors close hard was a kind of mercy. We talked, wrote in the evenings. She had opinions about things, clear ones, that she stated without performance. She had a way of writing fast when she was interested and slow when she was thinking, and I learned to read the pace of her pen the way you learn to read tone of voice. She asked me about my cases, not politely but actually. She wanted to understand how the law worked in the territory, what the limits of it were, where I was required to produce outcomes I thought were wrong. I talked about those things more than I had in years. Clara had been patient but not interested in the law. Marin was interested. I was coming home from a week on the circuit in late May when Harlan Tate stopped me on the road. He said, "Your wife's been in the paddock with that Palomino every morning." I said, "I know." He said, "She go in the saddle yet?" I said, "Not yet." He looked off toward the hills the way men do when they're deciding whether to say something. Then he said, "That horse stood while she put a halter on him yesterday. I seen it. I was coming by on the road and she didn't see me." He paused. He let her. I rode home thinking about that, about the 4 years, about the man from Albuquerque with his collarbone, about all the intention that had shown up at Cato and been refused, and about Marin going in with a book and waiting. I unsaddled my horse and came around to the paddock, and she was there at the fence, watching Cato eat. I leaned on the rail next to her. She knew I was there without looking. She developed a sensitivity to change in her peripheral field that was something close to a sixth sense. She turned and looked at me, and I must have looked tired because she wrote in her notebook, "Hard week." I said, "Harlan Tate says you put the halter on him." She wrote, "Last Tuesday." She thought, then added, "He stood for it." I said, "How long did that take?" She wrote, 3 weeks of nothing, then he was ready. I looked at the horse. He was looking at me with the flat, superior patience he'd always had. I said, "What do you think he was listening for?" She thought about that for a moment, and I watched her think, the way she went slightly still when she was working something out. Then she wrote, "Something that didn't need anything from him." She paused. Then, "I think he had enough of need." I don't know that I answered that. I was aware of standing at the fence rail next to a woman who had come into my house less than 2 months before, and who had accomplished in that time what two of Harlan's best hands and a specialist from Albuquerque could not. And the thought I had, not a proud thought, and not one I let sit too long, was that I understood the horse. June came in dry. I was home more that month than usual, the circuit lighter, and I spent the mornings in the study and the evenings on the porch. And Marin was there in the late afternoons after her work was done, in the chair nearest the rail, with a book or her mending. She had adapted to the porch the way she adapted to most things, not by making demands, but by making herself at home, which is a different skill. One evening she put her mending down and wrote something in her notebook, and held it out across the porch chair arm toward me without looking up. I leaned over and read. "I like it here." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I'm glad." She wrote, "I wasn't sure I would." I said, "Nor was I." She looked up then, and we looked at each other across the porch in the evening light, and she had an expression I'd learned to read, which was a very slight softening around the eyes that meant something between contentment and amusement, and I felt something that I did not say then and did not need to say. She put her mending back, and we sat until the light was gone. I was at the courthouse early on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June when Esparza rode up. He was not a man who rode fast for nothing, so I came out of the building when I heard him. He pulled up and said, "She's on the horse." I said, "What?" He said, "She saddled Cato this morning and she's riding him. He shook his head. "He's something to see." I said I'd be home by noon, and he said she'd be done by noon, but I should come anyway. I was on the road by 10. I came up the hill toward the property, and I could see the paddock from there, and she was in the open field beyond the paddock, the wide flat that ran toward the north fence line. She was riding him at a full run. The Palomino's coat was the color of a new coin in the morning sun, and she sat him like she'd been riding him for years, upright, entirely at ease, her coat dark behind her. The horse moved the way I'd never seen him move, smooth and reaching and willing, and she let him go. I pulled my horse up on the hill and I watched. Harlan Tate's place bordered mine on the north, and he'd come out to his own fence line. I could see him from the hill, watching. His hands were on the top rail and he wasn't moving. She brought Cato around in a long arc toward the south, and he came down to a canter and then a walk as she turned him back toward the paddock. She saw me on the hill and she raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more like acknowledgement. Like, yes, this happened. I rode down. By the time I got to the paddock she dismounted and was loosening the girth, and the horse was standing quiet, his neck slightly bowed, still breathing. She ran a hand along his neck, and he didn't move. She wrote in her notebook while still looking at him. He just needed the right person not to need anything from him. I read that. I said, "How'd you know you were the right person?" She wrote, "I didn't." She looked up at me. She held the notebook out toward me again, and I could see she'd added one word after a small pause in the handwriting. "Yet." I took the notebook and looked at that word, and I was aware of something in my chest that was not entirely unlike what I'd felt watching her in the paddock the first morning, which was a kind of release, quiet and unannounced, of something I'd been holding for a long time. I handed the notebook back. I said, "You know he's never let any man on him." She wrote, "I know." She was looking at the horse, not at me, but her mouth had that slight set it got when she was amused. She wrote, "He has better judgment than most." I said, "Present company." She wrote, "Present company accepted." Then she looked at me, and it was the full look, not the reading my lips look, but the one that took in the whole face, and she held it for a moment in the way she held silences, which was completely. She put the notebook away and turned back to the horse, and I stood there in the paddock in the June morning with the dust still settling and the Palomino standing quiet between us, and I thought, this is the shape of it then. This is what it looks like now. The next morning she rode him again at sunrise. I was up early, didn't mean to watch. I was at the kitchen window with my coffee and I heard hoofbeats and looked up. She came past the house at a walk first, heading out to the flat, and Cato's coat in the early light was like polished metal, and she was sitting straight and easy on him, the reins loose, the horse's ears forward, not performing, just going. I stood at the window with my coffee and I watched until they were small in the distance, and I let myself feel what I was feeling, which was not easy for me, had never been easy, but which I had enough sense by then not to push away. What I was feeling was chosen. Not swept up or flattered or indebted, not grateful in the counting way. Chosen the way she'd come here not knowing what she'd find and stayed because the finding was worth staying for. The way she'd walked into a paddock with a horse that had refused every man who came at it with intention, and she had come without intention, and the horse had walked up behind her and stood there. The way she filled in what was missing, not by filling it exactly, but by being present in the spaces in her own way. That's not a small thing at 63, to feel chosen. Esparza was at the kitchen door a little while later with the morning report. He looked past me toward the window out of habit, and then he said, "She's something, that woman." It wasn't said to me as much as to the morning. I said, "She is." He nodded and read off his list. She came back in with the light full up, cheeks pink from the wind. She came into the kitchen and poured coffee and stood at the counter, and when she looked up at me I was still at the window. She raised an eyebrow, which was her way of asking a question. I said, "How was he?" She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Honest." She thought, then added, "The same both days. Doesn't save anything for show." I said, "That'll do." She nodded and drank her coffee, and Esparza came back in with something he'd forgotten, and the morning went on. There is a thing that happens toward the end of a long life that I don't think enough is said about. You start to believe that what's gone is the whole account, that what has been lost is the permanent total. You keep going because the alternative is worse, but you keep going without expecting much. You do the work. You ride the circuit. You feed the horse that nobody else can manage, and you accept that you are the kind of man who will care for an unrideable horse out of some stubbornness or devotion that is too late in the game to make sense. And then something happens that is not a grand event. A woman with a leather notebook comes on the stage in April. She stands at a fence in the dark and says the horse is listening for something. She goes into a paddock with a book and waits. She tells you she likes it here, in writing, over her mending, without looking up. And you understand that what's been lost is not the whole account. That's not a lesson. It's just the fact of what happened, which I set down here as a man sets down a fact, plainly and without ornament because it doesn't need any. I can see the paddock from the window where I write this. The Palomino is at the far rail. It's early, the light's still low, and in a little while I'll hear her come down the stairs in her boots and go out to him. The coffee will be hot. The house will be quiet in the way a house is quiet when it's occupied by someone who knows how to be in a room. There's nothing broken here. That's what I wanted to say.